Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
It's 10 minutes before 8, and notwithstanding the domestic horror of that shooting at Plymouth, it is the story of Afghan and the return of some British military personnel that's dominating our conversation. So it's great to be able to return to Defence Secretary Ben Wallace for more details, who joins me now. Good to have you on the line. It is around 600 troops, I read, who are going back to Afghanistan. Exactly what details can you give about the deployment, particularly how long the men and women might actually be serving there? Good morning.
Good morning, Nick. So these guys, men and women, predominantly from 16 Air Assault Brigade, but also from Joint Force Command, will go in. They'll be in between now and towards the end of the month, early September, in line with the September the 11th exit that the United States had announced some months ago. Predominantly, they will be logisticians, air movers, people to process the 3,000 to 4,000 people that we will be bringing out, but also a small element, but enough to protect them as well, because we don't want them to be attacked. And then once we've got those people out, and those people that we're going to bring out are obviously continued of the Afghan interpreters and all those Afghans we have an obligation to, the British passport holders, who are a separate group of people that could be just British security guards, for example, who've been helping aid agencies, and members of the rest of government as we draw down and relocate the embassy.
But what happens then in Kabul, Secretary of State?
Well, once the British embassy will relocate, there will be a diplomatic presence. They will retain. It won't be as big as it was.
Will it locate to the airport? Where are you planning to put it?
I can't, for operational reasons, I'm not going to, afraid, announce where they are. But the plan is to continue to be there. Obviously, the Taliban have an obligation to protect them. But if the Taliban show themselves not to be able to do that or want to do that, then, of course, further decisions would be made in the future. But look, when that drawdown is done, then we have exited Afghanistan. And that's been the slow but regretful process that we've had to go through.
But exiting it and leaving the Afghans to a rather frightening fate, as one newspaper says, going back to the days of the Dark Ages, 12-year-old girls being rounded up as sex slaves, Secretary of State. Is that a good look for the UK to walk away?
It's not a good look for the international community. I've been quite clear about that. I called the deal that was done by President Trump a rotten deal. It produced a weakening of the Afghan government, a momentum to the Taliban it didn't deserve. It basically turned around to the Taliban and said, you're the ones to deal with. At the time, we had got to a more stable situation in Afghanistan. We were committing 700 troops on a regular basis just to keep Kabul secure. The Taliban were being contained, and now we're in a situation that's quite the opposite. And I think, all the lessons I've ever learned in counterterrorism, both as a soldier and security minister and everything else, is failed states, instability leads to terrorism, leads to poverty crisis. And that's what we've seen. That's one of the reasons we went in there 20 years ago. Regretfully, we're going to go. The international community, I did try to see when the United States made their announcement whether we could bring a bigger coalition back. A lot of the international community, a lot of parliaments are weary of that fight, and therefore we were left with no option.
Secretary of State, you're a military bloke, you're closer to it than I, but 457 people were deployed there, never to return, and thousands more have sustained injuries. Was it worth the price?
Well, one part of it was worth it. For 20 years, we prevented Al-Qaeda, which at the time was probably the most successful terrorism organization that inflicted 9/11 on the United States, but also a significant number of British losses of lives. Al-Qaeda in the early 2000s was the main threat to our high streets. We have all obviously focused on the IS, the ISIL lot, but fundamentally Al-Qaeda were the first. They were very, very professional, and they were responsible for killing lots of people around the world. And if you remember, the first time people went in Afghanistan after 9/11 was to cut that out, cut the Taliban out, who had been supporting and hosting them and allowing them to train. And for those 20 years, the blood and treasure that we all tragically spent and lost has kept that part clear, and ultimately ended in the death of Osama bin Laden. But that's an example of where the West needs to learn the lesson, is that you manage problems, you don't fix them. You can't fly in, whack someone and fly out and think that the world is just going to all go back to normal. You have to come along with your aid. And to be fair, for another 20 years, we spent £4 billion of British taxpayers' money in Afghanistan. We educated, alongside the rest of the community, 3 million women, and we trained 300,000 members of the armed forces. That's quite an investment. And there are voices, and you hear President Biden say it, that says, well, now after all that investment, it's time for them to stand on their feet. I think,
but respectfully, they can't, Secretary. I mean, one has to question the training, and I'm sure the men and women work damned hard, but those 300,000 odd, and I wouldn't want to face them either, they seem to be rather melting away in the face of the Taliban. Was the training robust enough? And they're not able to hold the line, are they?
Well, look, I think that's the lesson of the West, which some of us already have always known, is you don't undo 1,000 years of culture in 20 years. You don't just, yes, you can train people, and I have to say the Afghans who have stood and fought have done an amazing job in pretty horrendous circumstances against an enemy that doesn't care much for its own life, let alone other people's lives. It has done an amazing job, and there are very brave men and women of the Afghan armed forces right now fighting for survival. And the United States are supporting them with air cover at the moment and airstrikes. But that's the lesson. You manage problems. You can't fix problems. But you also have to have an international community to do it. And I think, I did try at the time, but Britain can't unilaterally go in. Militarily, I could send 10,000 people. We could go in. We could do it for 2-3 years, but we're not. We have the forces to do that, but that is not how you're going to fix Afghanistan.
So you can tell me here and now, you never see mass redeployment of British military personnel in Afghanistan, Secretary of State?
I'm going to leave every option open. If the Taliban have a message from last time, you start hosting Al-Qaeda, you start attacking the West, or countries like that, we could be back. There are many ways of delivering the way we need to defend our country. One of the reasons in my defence review, I've done a lot of time and money, and the Prime Minister supported me in reconfiguring our armed forces, is to be less dependent on one other nation, so that we could bring together international communities in future and not face a single nation pulling out and the whole house of cards falling over, but also to give me the capability to deal with threats wherever they emerge around the world in many different methods. Cyber is one thing for hostile states, but of course, kinetic strike, as we call it, which I announce periodically to Parliament, where we take action from outside in a country, is a capability we have.
So you're not saying you won't go back, Secretary of State?
I'll do whatever we need to do to defend the country, and I'll.
And back to the men and women are going over, you'll be aware that we have figures, there are around 3,000 translators that were used by the UK forces. Sadly, hundreds have been murdered since 2014. Can you give an assurance that, as best as you can, every single translator, his or her family and those at peril, Britain will stand by them and get them out?
Yeah, so far we have brought back 1,400 before the big announcement. We've brought back nearly another 2,000. The people on the ground in Afghanistan right now are there predominantly processing all those applications. They're not there for other sort of diplomatic functions. Nearly all our forces, our diplomats, are processing those remainders. We have one challenge, which is the Afghan government insists they have a passport to leave Afghanistan, and if they're slow in the documentation, that slows it down. We've brought back over nearly 2,000 since. We've got another 2,000 in the pipeline. Priti Patel and I have worked incredibly closely. We've changed rules so that they can come through third countries, so we can process them even after we've gone. We've taken certain risks around speed, and my only current challenge is to make sure British local authorities are leaning in, helping them provide housing for these people who have earned their place. We have some great local authorities, but we have had some others who don't seem to want to help. That's regretful. I will use whatever accommodation I can.
Do you want to name and shame, Mr. Wallace?
I will, not yet, but...
Okay,
look,
well, you know where to find me.
This is a national endeavour. These people risk their lives, and, we are not talking about chances. We are talking about people and their families who absolutely helped us stay alive, and we should do our best to help them.
Can I lastly put to you, can I hear equal strong words in support of the Gurkhas? You'll be aware that a small band of them have been on a protest for, I think, 6 or 7 days. You may well indeed have seen them about your duties through the course of this week. Will you be picking up the phone to your boss, Boris Johnson, or Rishi Sunak? Can't they have parity on their pensions, Mr. Wallace?
Well, look, first of all, I will happily go meet them. I don't know where the narratives come that I won't. My father fought the Gurkhas in the 1950s, so I don't need any lectures from people who've never been in uniform, mainly the Labour Party, telling me that somehow I don't care for the Gurkhas. This band of Gurkhas were Gurkhas under the 1947 scheme, the scheme that was changed by Labour in the 97 and 2003. That meant that those people have a different terms. They have a 15-year term to get a full pension, and at the time the British soldier had a 22-year term. So actually they had a different rate, but they had a better qualification period. That was changed in early 2000s, which means all Gurkhas have been and now are on parity with the British soldier. There's no difference in their pension at all. So existing pensioners mainly for the last 20 odd years are fine. This is a small group. They have, I'm afraid, they made their position clear in 2003. The then government fought them in the court and was successful. And I'm afraid the main sticking point is retrospective changing of pensions is never something we've ever done in any government. This was a 1947 scheme, and they were changed when we basically closed down Hong Kong in recognition that in those days, vast majority of the Gurkhas were based in Hong Kong and went back to Nepal from there. So I'm happy to meet them. It's been quite a long time that they've made their positions clear, but successive governments have been clear about retrospective pensions. They are incredibly brave. We do support them. But that community had a 15-year qualifying period for their pension as opposed to the British, who had 22 years.
All right. I'm grateful for your time. Thank you. Extended interview today. Ben Wallace is Defence Secretary, appearing here on LBC, where almost 2 minutes after 8, it's news time with Simon Conway.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, a young child and a gunman are understood to be among the 6 people killed in a shooting